Furthermore, due to other commitments, Robert might have to excuse himself before the end of the proceedings, so that's why I've asked him to speak first. Get him while he's here. I'll then move to Susan Parnell, who is professor in the School of Geography at the University of Bristol and also emeritus professor at the African Centre for Cities at the University of Cape Town. Susan has been actively involved in policy debates around the SDGs and has written extensively on how cities, past and present, respond to policy change. After Sue, we'll have Sheila Foster, who is Professor of Urban Law and Policy at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Sheila writes on the role of cities in promoting social and economic welfare, environmental and climate justice, and racial equality. She's the former chair of the Advisory Committee for the Global Parliaments of Mayors and is currently a member of the New York City Mayors' panel on climate change. And then Disebogo Makele is Program Manager of Sustainable and Resilient Cities at the South African Cities Network. Her work focuses on institutional and governance shifts that are required to accelerate sustainability transitions in cities with emphasis on climate change adaptation, water resilience, energy diversification, and integrated waste management. A mouthful indeed. I've asked the speakers to each present for about 16 minutes roughly, after which we'll have some time for engagement. So to maximize that time, let me not waste any more of it and immediately hand over to Robert to get us started. And thank you in advance.
Thanks, Marius. I will see if I can share my screen. I'm not very good at doing this, but I will try. Is it going to share it? Which one is it going to do? Okay, here we go. So, PowerPoint Live. This is new. That's not good. I hope you can see the slides will appear here when they're ready. Gosh.
Yes, we can.
It's getting there. You know, I'm here to replace Gianluca Crispi. I apologize for not being as young and vibrant as Gianluca is, but unfortunately he is somewhat sidetracked with the small matter of COP26 and his work for the Climate Change Convention. So I will move on. I found myself starting very much today thinking about, I hope this thing does come up, but we will see. When asked to make these comments, I immediately reverted, as I often do, to sort of you know, my law school self, and when, you know, in a way of sort of admitting that I knew little more now than I did then, and started going through a rule-breaking exercise of looking at the title and thinking, okay, rebuilding a more just, climate resilient and equitable urban future for all. And I remember once being advised never to ask a lawyer a question because they only have two types of reply. One of those is another question, and the other one is just to say it depends. So, okay, today's session title isn't exactly a question, but being a lawyer, I've interpreted it as one anyway. And I'm taking it as, what will it take to rebuild and what might the role of law be? And then reverting to that legal type again, in consequence, and in case you're wondering where I'm going to go and what I'm going to say, in case you need to leave early, I'm going to proceed to ask a few more questions and conclude by saying it depends. So first, the question of rebuild. Let me see if I can stop this thing and start it again. It's very annoying. Oh, it won't stop now either. Okay, well, the first point, rebuild. Obviously, I think the title is building on the issue of COVID as well as climate change, although that got dropped from the title along the way. Oh, there's something appearing. I'm not sure whether rebuilding is a need or is it a response to a perceived opportunity. You know, Anel referred to the fact that we do have a number of problems with infrastructure and all sorts of other things, which I would very much agree with. But is that really what's driving a lot of people's concept of the need to rebuild, or is it that we see a chance to change the direction things are going in and to change how we approach matters in society. Either way, there are very strong interest groups around this, and they're often competing interest groups, usually because of a fairly short-term logic. I think if we look at global vaccine inequality, we can see a very good illustration of this. Objectively, we know as a world that we're not safe until we're all safe. But at the same time, we're still tending to focus on what is right in front of us and what is close to us, both geographically and temporally. So, are we, that is a very short term and immediate. We know that won't keep us safe, but that's how we're operating. Of course, that should be a legal question. The law should have a role in looking at society and saying, how do we manage and balance relationships? Particularly, how do we bring them around to a longer term good? And particularly, how do we address competing interests when we've got asymmetrical relationships? I have a feeling, though, that the law probably isn't going to be in the middle of this, and that it's more likely to end up being a political process. Will there be a legal requirement that we do some things differently? Or are we going to leave the priorities open and slip back into new habits, old habits rather? So the question on rebuild, really is first that point of why are we looking at rebuilding and how are we conceiving of it? And then are we really ready to deal with what that requires? Then moving on to the second term of just. Obviously, that's a very old one. And we're very aware, all of us, that COVID has highlighted what injustice means. Climate change has also probably highlighted what injustice means, particularly over the last couple of decades. And the question then becomes, are we politically ready and are we mature enough for a just future? I'm personally very much a disciple of the former Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld. And based on that, my conclusion would be that we have to pursue this just future, whether or not we think we're ready for it, and whether we think it's close or far away. It might not be very achievable in the immediate future, but that doesn't change the need to build it into our frameworks. And we probably will end up having to pursue it fairly pragmatically. Then going on to climate resilience. I wonder if there's another way of doing this. I don't know. Moving on to the question. Is that better? Does that work now? I don't know. I hope so. Moving on to climate resilience, I'm looking at the question that we have to look quite carefully at what climate resilience means and how we achieve it. We know that we have to limit the damage that our cities contribute to climate change if we are to be resilient over the long term. We also know that we have to protect the economic assets that cities represent if our economies are to be climate resilient. It's a huge amount of investment, it's a huge amount of active wealth generation, it's a huge amount of job creation and all sorts of other things. But we also have to remember that climate resilience is a very immediate thing for the poorest in our societies. For a shack dweller who lives on a deforested hillside or alongside a river, there are some pretty direct risks that they have to cope with. The Human Rights Council has just recognized, just a week or two ago, the human right to a safe and healthy environment. Are we ready to say that that is for everybody and that that is an issue that we are going to address in this context? Equitable. So in the interest of time, I will try and keep that one short. SDG 10.3 seeks increasing equality of outcome, the current sustainable development proxy for equity. We know from the establishment of some of the earliest equity courts in the 11th century and the fact that we're still dealing with this issue today, equity isn't an endpoint. It's a process and it's a state of being that requires a very strong legal system and a good governance framework to be able to maintain it. we're struggling to do that at the national level in many countries, probably most. And we must ask whether we have the right tools to achieve that at the global level where COVID and climate change are existing. Then moving on to urban, asking the question, well, what is urban? I mean, that comes up fairly often in those involved with these circles. But in legal terms, what is it? Does it refer to cities? Does it refer to permanent human settlements? And if so, how do we define those? Does it include hinterlands and the connections? These are questions of both physical realities, the relationships amongst spaces and places, as well as questions of institutions. For the spaces and places, the law needs to build up the connections amongst them and not to fragment them. For the institutions, the structures and the connections amongst people, we also need to look at these and recognize that they're very hard to manage and that we're forced to accept that the world and the law isn't very good at recognizing urban as a thing. Urban tends to be seen as existing across and between other things. And I think it's important to note that the law has a very big role to play in keeping geographical and institutional relationships clear and functional. And that becomes ever more a reality in both the context of climate change and COVID. 6, the future. That might seem straightforward enough, but the big question with the future is always, when does it begin? And how are we defining what the parameters of the future need to be? The law needs to operate on some sort of set of facts. It needs a source of evidence, and it needs to have some kind of broadly accepted objectives of where we're trying to get to. So setting our baselines, what is wrong that needs to be rebuilt, and how do we want to rebuild it, and where do we want to go, describing those aspirations is extremely important right now. The law does need to be part of that process, but more importantly, it probably needs to respond to that process. I'm not moving through, am I? Finally, all. There, immediately when seeing the word all, I turn immediately to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That opening phrase, which is probably one of the more powerful around in a legal text, or at least a semi-legal text. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They're endowed with reason and conscience and should act toward one another in a spirit of brotherhood. We, all of us, say, and as lawyers, we are bound to adhere to the fact that this is a universal truth. The role of law in building a just future depends upon whether it is built on that truth or not. And that leaves me with my closing depends. So apologies for being a little philosophical today, but that was where that title took me. And thank you very much for giving me the time to speak. Over.
Thanks, Robert. Also for highlighting that if we want to rebuild something, we must also look at what is there at the moment. And law is often invisibly sort of wired into the foundations of the status quo. And so what keeps injustice in place might well be what we are tasked with overseeing. Over to Susan, if you're ready, Sue.
Yes, thank you. And thanks so much, colleagues. I quite often feel fraudulent when I talk about cities, but I definitely feel fraudulent when I talk about cities and law. So it's nice to be in company of a domain of work that I think is absolutely fundamental to the task of building. I was glad that Robert reminded us of the distinction between politics and the law. I would draw a distinction sometimes also between politics and practice or implementation. And I want to take off today, in fact, from a positive point of politics, which is that I think we have actually got agreement on quite strong normative or political direction. And at least at the moment, there is scope for action to implement in, at least for me, what are a set of values that I can ascribe to. How we do that, of course, is up for discussion. And I'm particularly pleased to be talking to and with lawyers. I like to think almost thinking like a lawyer as part of a wider question of thinking like a state and how we rebuild a state. Because I think it draws attention to something beyond the individual. And we're sitting at COP in our, very much in all of our consciousness at the moment. And if we simply took the climate agenda, but if we took also the wider SDG aspirations, it seems to me there are things that we can do as individuals, but we're not going to scale up, and we're not going to embed, and we're not going to achieve any degree of robustness until we get systemic change. And it seems to me that it's in that context then that the role of the law becomes fundamental. And I want to try, I think it asks us to look at different kinds of questions and different kinds of framings of the city if we are to do that. So let me give you an example. Quite a number of us, I'm sure, around the table have been involved in one or another development of frameworks, devices to try and ensure that we are comprehensive, that we don't miss many bases, and that we focus on what's important. But typically, if you look at the sort of early kind of frameworks, stuff coming out of Sen's work, or stuff coming in, for example, the different livelihoods framework, the risk frameworks, a lot of those are quite normative frameworks. We must look at the social and the economic and the environmental. And I think if you begin to start rethinking what we have to do in order to achieve the values of a more just city, of a more climate resilient city, actually what you have to do in a kind of way. And I find a legal angle on a framework that we use in a very big project I'm involved with called Peak Urban, P-E-A-K, Urban. There's a website, you can just Google it, it'll come up. And I want to just walk you through it, not because I think the device of the framework is important, although I do. I think fundamentally it's looking at how states work rather than at the normative frame, and therefore is particularly useful for thinking about the role of the law. And I just thought I'd try and illustrate that if I can. And part of what I think I'm trying to imply is that it gives us the courage to say that the law is important, both, Maurice, yes, because it holds us back, but also because without reform, one can't actually achieve change in the medium term. So PEAK has, it's an acronym, P-E-A-K. It's a device. Let me try and talk about what it is. So we talk about P as prediction, and basically what that is it's the sort of new urban science, all the stuff that we measure in order to understand cities. Robert's point about what is the city, where does the law apply? And it's prompted in a way by a lot of the sort of new data analytics, the rise of some of the sort of spatial capacities. But it's become quite a fundamental element and a reconfiguration away from simply what the old planners used to know, or what the municipal treasurer used to hold in, and it was his head about what should happen. And those intelligence capacities, it seems to me, are legally relevant in two respects. One is about the control of the data, the simple question of intellectual property. Do municipalities control their own data or not? Do they have to buy it back? Is it public data? Is it not? These are absolutely fundamental legal questions. But there are additional legal questions there. There are questions about standards, about how we measure and what has to be measured. And if you go into any local authority and you say, oh, I'd like you to collect data and so and so and so and so, basically, unless that information has to be collected in order to be legally compliant, it will be done on an ad hoc basis. Okay, so if it's important information, and there's, you just only have to look at the health sort of domain. What is a communicable disease and what is not a communicable disease? What is a breach of air quality standards and what is not a breach of air quality standards? So the information and the legality of the information seems to me to be fundamental, okay, to this whole idea of prediction. What do we understand the urban future to be? How do we measure it? E in our framing comes out of the very scientific literature, and it's the idea of emergence. I'm a social scientist by training, and the way that I think of the E here is about what is catalytic, what happens because things come together. In other words, what happens when you get both population growth and the decline of household size simultaneously, well, then you really need lots and lots of houses, right? And then you really gobble up land, and then you really impact on any climate emissions. Got nothing to do with conventional descriptions of that, but it's an emergent property. Okay, the classic of a value change in individuals might have been the rise of the neoliberal state, okay, which we saw. It made a huge change on the kind of cities that emerged. Emergent properties in Africa might be how people navigate the difference between the formal and the informal parts of the city. So there are emergent questions there. And the law is not exempt from that, because laws often drive and are catalytic of what emerges in a city. I've already given you the example of neoliberalism, where the retreat of the law, okay, the change of the law or the retreat of the law had huge implications for how we saw the city. And it seems to me that even just making sure that with a legal eye, one understands the interplay, for example, of land use titling, of densification policies, because the law can be catalytic of a new emergent urbanism. And so there's space in that PE and the E to be thinking legally about whether the role of the law is a progressive or retrospective one in terms of what we're looking for. The A refers to adoption, okay, and this is quintessentially, in some senses, about law and institutions. What we're talking about here is what happens in practice. What are we doing that lays down what I often call the palimpsest of the city that sticks, okay, either in the physical form, we change block size, or we change air rights, or we change the powers and functions of one part of government and not the other part of government. These are very often, not exclusively, sometimes they're fiscal rather than legal, okay? But the law is probably the single biggest force determining the size and shape, if you like, of how the city is configured. Okay, and yet we always talk about it. I mean, Morrissey spoke about the hidden forces. The law is a hidden force in this regard. We talk about consumer behavior, we talk about investment, but we never talk about the way that the sediment of the city is almost impossible to understand without an understanding of the role of the law. And the role of the law where it is not so much imposed often, but where it is not even formulated. So the absence of the law as much as the presence of the law, the rejection of the law as much as the upholding of the law. So absolutely fundamental there. Excuse me. It's really nice coughing online because no one looks at you as if you're going to give them COVID. But then the last part of the PEA on our peak framework has to do with K, and that's about knowledge. And that's really about the question of what do you teach people? How do they learn from each other? Do we copy the law? We all know about how awful it is to copy other people's laws, not just because it's plagiarism and theft and all those things, but also because it's really bad and inappropriate. But sometimes it's quite useful to look at precedent. Okay, so, you know, this tension between what do we teach, how do we know, and how do we distill that, and how do we record that? And what's the role, in a sense, for me as a scholar? I think here the question is, how do we publish so that there is a record, and a record that is useful in the transformative process? And happily, I think lawyers are often trained to be very critical, but they very rarely seem to understand that their critical faculties can be used in a formative as rather than just a deconstructive sense. And it seems to me that that's one of the things that we have to begin to start to rethink. When we're thinking about rebuilding cities, we not only need to understand what is wrong, but we need to understand what to preserve. We need to understand how to fuse. We need to understand how to amend. We need to understand how to expand. And all of those things are fundamental to the practices of urban law. And law, it seems to me, as I hope you've heard me saying very, very clearly, is the cement that holds the city together. And cement is, of course, both a force for good and a force for bad. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Susan. I think you put your finger on the tension that sort of exists between laws' dual function to both sort of simultaneously maintain stability and drive change, and having to do both at once is crucial in this context, and also about how law not only as the rules of the game, but also how over time law becomes culture to normatively shape places and processes. And thank you very much for that. Over to a side of the world where the day has just started. Sheila, over to you.
Great, thank you. I'm going to try to bring up my screen while we're doing this. Okay, can you see that? Can you see my screen?
Yes, it's there.
Yes.
Okay, great. Hi. So thank you for inviting me to this really interesting and esteemed panel to talk about rebuilding a more just, climate resilient, and equitable urban future. Robert has unpacked that title or deconstructed it very well. And Susan's talk has, I think, really focused on what the potential of law can do, as well as science. And I thought what I'd do today is to just talk about what local governments, what municipalities, I'll avoid the word cities for now, because some of these are, cities in the traditional sense in terms of big cities, but some of them are smaller and even suburban, actually. But talk a little bit about what law is doing right now to make local governments and cities more climate resilient and just. And I want to talk about the U.S. context to give an example of what's possible. As you know, today, as our President Biden is about to fly off to Europe to attend to COP, he'll probably be arriving empty-handed, at least on the federal level. Because it's been difficult for our national government to come to any agreement, even in this recent spending bill, on climate measures. And in a federalist system, a lot of power is left to the states, to our 50+ states. And outside of California and New York, and maybe a couple of others, the majority of those states also haven't done much on climate. So again, California is a clear outlier, as is New York. And so that has left a lot of room for local governments to innovate. And they are innovating not just in terms of mitigation measures to reduce their own carbon impact, but also, coastal cities like New Orleans and New York that have been hit hard by hurricanes and tropical storms, and western cities like Los Angeles and Portland that have been impacted by wildfires and heat waves are also really focused on adaptation, right? And these adaptation plans are increasingly focused on frontline communities, or those most vulnerable to sea level rise, wildfires, heat waves, or flooding. And they're increasingly incorporating a explicitly climate equity focus in both their mitigation, really, and adaptation efforts, as a way to focusing on mitigating harm to vulnerable populations, but also to effecting a just transition. And that could be efforts that focus resources on socially vulnerable populations, usually low-income and racial minorities here, particularly those lacking access to quality housing and healthcare. But some cities target the provision of green infrastructure or building retrofitting and other things to socially vulnerable neighborhoods. Cities have a lot of opportunity to innovate because, they have a lot of assets and infrastructure that adds to greenhouse gas emissions, and so these things include, their own buildings, sometimes power plants, landfills, and waste facilities. They have sizable fleets of motor vehicles, which they can electrify, such as police cars and garbage trucks. And of course, they expend vast amounts of money procuring goods and services. And so the budget is an area of opportunity. And I'll talk about that in a minute. The one thing I'll say before I give some more specific examples is that The one thing that's happening in the U.S. because of a partisan divide in which the cities are what we call blue, they're heavily Democratic or liberal, and the state legislatures are increasingly red, is that what we see now is states preempting in some, especially in places like Florida and Texas, preempting some of this local action around climate change. And I'll talk about that in a bit. And unfortunately, the power of local governments, as it is in a lot of places, is heavily dependent on the power that our states give to them. Local governments are not mentioned in our federal constitution. And so what the states give, they can often take away. And so we see some of that in the climate area. So I just want to talk a little bit about where local governments are regulating. And really in kind of three areas. And the first is around land use and building codes. The majority of local governments have exert the most control and autonomy over their physical environment. So land use regulation and building codes are among, I think, the most active areas of regulation. Local governments, as I mentioned, can reduce energy use in buildings, change their fleets of vehicles to be more energy efficient, and require new infrastructure to incorporate green design. So New York City, for instance, just passed Local Law 97, which is a building performance standard to reduce greenhouse gases in new buildings, new construction. Emissions from buildings are about 71% of New York City's greenhouse gas emissions. So reducing these by 80% by 2050 is a significant move by New York. So one area is these building performance standards. Boston and other cities are moving in this direction. There are green design standards, what we call LEED, and so you may be familiar with this, but again, these are standards that ensure energy efficient buildings for new construction. And increasingly, Berkeley was the first city to institute a natural gas ban. When you build new buildings, you cannot put natural gas in there. And increasingly, cities across the country are beginning to do that, although some of this states have tried to preempt some of this. The second is renewable clean energy standards, replacing, again, natural gas with wind, solar, et cetera, and renewable energy targets for municipal utilities. Los Angeles City Council just a few weeks ago voted unanimously to transition to 100% clean energy by 2035. And it would see the city replace its natural electricity generation with wind, solar, and battery storage. And achieving this objective requires a lot of distributed energy, like in small scale systems like microgrids that can help accommodate the grid's reliability. So this transition to a smart grid in Los Angeles would be significant. We've seen over the years local bans on the process of hydrofracking, which is injecting chemicals deep into shales to extract natural gas. Local governments have been banning those because of the negative externalities that some of those chemicals leak into groundwater and are dangerous to surrounding communities. Again, there's been some attempted preemption of those, but a lot of those have stood up. Some governments are prohibiting the building or expansion of fossil fuel operations around ports and other transportation areas. Finally, budgetary restrictions. There are lots that a local government, particularly large cities which have multi-billion dollar budgets, can do, such as divesting from fossil fuel or directing their spending towards clean energy. A number of cities have announced that they're going to be divesting from fossil fuels. They include New York, Los Angeles, New Orleans, and Pittsburgh. Some local governments are imposing taxes on environmentally hazardous activities or adopting local tax incentives and abatements for the transition of private actors towards alternative and renewable sources of energy. The last thing I talk about is what local governments are doing on climate equity and just transitions. President Biden signed this historic executive order earlier this year that included what's called a Justice 40 initiative. And that initiative is to ensure that all federal investments in climate and clean energy will go to disadvantaged communities. This is a way to achieve environmental justice. What's less known and talked about is that this initiative really scaled up from state and local governments that had already put this in place. In particular, the Justice 40 initiative at the federal level was modeled after New York State's landmark Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act of 2019, which was shaped by environmental justice and community leaders from around that state. A couple of other examples are what I would call inclusive governance mechanisms at the local level. I talked earlier about building performance standards, which reduce greenhouse gas emissions from buildings. Increasingly, cities like Boston and St. Louis are incorporating vulnerable communities and other important stakeholders in the design and implementation of those standards. And that's been significant in terms of environmental and climate justice because mechanisms like carbon trading or carbon offsets in some of these programs have been very controversial, and including those frontline communities and voices in the design has made it so that the design of those kinds of programs are more responsive to those communities' concerns. And then finally, another equity feature that we see is what I would call redistribution and targeted financing. So when private actors or developers or building owners don't comply with these laws, they often have to pay fines for non-compliance. But cities are innovating around this, right? In Boston, owners of buildings that don't meet their emissions targets don't have a approved plan pay an alternative compliance payment. That's about a couple $100 per metric ton of CO2 in excess of each building's target. And that revenue is then channeled into what's called an Equitable Emissions Investment Fund that will prioritize environmental justice or frontline communities to finance building upgrades in those communities. And very similarly, Washington, D.C.'s building performance standard set aside has a dedicated funding for the district's new green bank, which leverages public funds to match financing from the DC Sustainable Energy Utility and support work with diverse contractors and to make loans to individuals, building owners, small businesses, and residents to upgrade their buildings and also to build or construct a green infrastructure in those areas. So I think there's a lot that cities can do, and that we are doing, at least in the U.S., led by a handful of large cities, but also a lot of smaller cities, subject to some, I think, some vulnerabilities such as state preemption. But again, there's been a scaling and a diffusion of these efforts, and I think that they represent the potential of what cities can do. Okay, let me stop sharing, or how do I do it? Okay, great. I think I stopped sharing, did I?
Yes.
Yes. Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Also highlighting for us isn't only safety and constraint. So it's source of law, even if subordinate and often the between sort of law and implementation and other forms of innovation. I'm particularly interested in the notion of how local laws can scale up and under what circumstances they do so. And it might be something that I ask of the other participants as well when we get to question time. It was also very nice to hear what cities can do both within and despite legal constraints and around legal constraints. And that's something that we see a lot of all over the world. At which point then, geographically closest to me, Ditebogo, if you could start.
I am here. I am just trying. Could Nicolette, Nicolene or Anel please share my presentation? I can't seem to be able to from my side, but let me try. Okay.
Equitable, I can try.
Okay, can you see it?
No.
Is it visible?
No, it's not.
Okay.
I'll try and share from my side.
Please do. Okay, but let me just start while the presentation is. So thank you so much for these really thought-provoking presentations that have been done. I'm going to take a different perspective. I'm from the South African Cities Network, and I'll just give an overview of what the South African Cities Network is and what we do, and then look at a few research projects that we did. But my angle is really around governance and how cities can look at and change the way they govern the sustainability transition. So in South Africa, we like to say that we have a very excellent policy architecture. We have frameworks, policies, and strategies and plans that are in place that address different aspects of sustainability and climate change. And they all clearly link cooperative governance and urban sustainability with a particular focus on the imperatives of a just urban transition. So we've got our National Development Plan, which has set goals for a just transition by 2030. We've got a National Climate Change Adaptation Strategy. We've got a National Climate Bill that's currently been deliberated on in Parliament. There's Renewable Energy Master Plan, biodiversity, this and the other. And all of these are duplicated at the local level. So a lot of our cities have climate change strategies and action plans. They've got biodiversity and nature-based solutions plans, etc. But what remains a challenge is implementation. So the question is, what is the impact of these legal frameworks and policies on the trajectory of sustainability transitions in cities, or on the pace of the transitions themselves? You can move to the next slide, Anel, thanks. So what I'm going to talk about is the institutional and governance shifts that are required for sustainability transitions in cities, based on some of the research projects that we embarked on and the findings of that research. But I'll go a bit quickly through what we do. Please go to the next slide, Anel. At the SACN, we are a network of cities. We say we are, the next slide, cities, and a network of cities for cities. And what we do is we promote good governance and management of South African cities. We look at the challenges that are facing our cities, particularly in the context of the global economic integration, but as well as the national development challenges. We look at knowledge generation and research application in how cities can then address these challenges that they face. And then we also promote shared learning partnerships across whole of government and all of society to support in the management of our cities. Next slide, please. And we've got 8 metropolitan municipalities that are part of the cities network. And I've already said this, that what we do is that we are a network of cities. We promote peer-to-peer learning between these cities. We provide a knowledge base, knowledge co-creation with the cities, looking at the challenges that they face and how we can apply that evidence-based research in the context of them solving the challenges that they have. And also we then advocate for the city voice to be heard throughout the the different spheres of government, but also with the whole of society. So if you look at the private sector, civil society organizations, academia, how we promote the voice of cities and partnerships between these different actors. Next slide, please. And we've got some of our flagship publications. Some we do every 5 years, like the State of South African Cities Report. We publish every 5 years, and it's sort of like a report card on how each administration has done. We've got a 5-year cycle in the local government space. And the State of Cities Report is really a reflection of what has transpired in the 5 years of the administration of our cities. And then it's also an agenda setter for incoming administrations. So as we're coming to the close of that 5-year period, we are going to issue the next State of Cities Report 2021, which will be issued later in the year. And then we've got the State of City Finances, which we do every 2 years, which goes into the different modalities of financing mechanisms that cities use, but also what the state of their finances are and what the opportunities are to look at different funding models for some of their mandates. And then the State of Crime in Cities Report, and then the Extended Public Works Program. You can go to the next slide. So the State of Cities Report 2016, next slide, please, really focused on a number of issues, but it looked at cities as engines of growth. And then each chapter, we've got thematic chapters in the State of Cities Report, and each chapter then discussed what was pertinent in terms of the thematic area, for instance, spatial integration, the built environment, what the issues were there. My area is sustainable cities, and what the State of Cities Report said in 2016 about sustainability in cities is that cities need to start embedding sustainability into their day-to-day service delivery, plans and implementation processes. They need to start accelerating the transition to sustainability as the pace is quite slow. And how we responded to that now in the previous 5-year period, 2016 to 2021, was to say, do we even know the extent to which our cities are becoming or not becoming sustainable? We've got these policies and strategies and plans that I mentioned, but do we know how they're doing in reality? So we conducted a series of research projects focusing on the different sustainability practices in cities. So we did a comparative analysis, which looked at what triggers certain sustainability practices in cities, what enables them to take place, what sort of actions and the variety of actors involved in these initiatives, and also what sort of partnerships are brokered with whole of society, different actors that are active in these cities. And then we did another project which looked at the efficacy and impact of indicators used in tracking progress. So if cities are engaging in implementing sustainability initiatives, are they tracking their progress? Can they say in the past 10 years, we have advanced this far, we have, we're going to achieve the goal that we set for ourselves for 2030 or 2040 in this way because we're able to track progress. So that the indicators project was about that. And then we did another one, which was really a showcase of sustainability practice in cities. After we did these two projects, we said, well, it's not all doom and gloom. Some of our cities are doing really exemplary work, even despite of the challenges that they face. You can move to the next slide. Now I'm going to just highlight, you can move to the next one. It's just showing the different projects that I just mentioned. Next slide. Again, the showcase. And then I'm just going to highlight, yes, you can go to the next one on key findings related to governance. So when we did the comparative analysis of sustainability practices in cities, this fact was confirmed, the one that I just mentioned in my opening, that we've got a good policy architecture in South Africa. We've got all these frameworks that talk about a sustainable transition and a just transition, climate resilience. You know, they say all the right things that we would like to believe that our cities are pursuing. However, the successful implementation and outcome of these sustainability goals will depend on cooperative governance and an all of society approach. And there is where the limitations were in terms of the corporate governance architecture or arrangements between national, provincial, and local government. And we saw that in some cities, intermediaries play an instrumental role in brokering partnerships. So intermediaries will be like development agencies that are not completely owned by cities. Some would be a branch of a provincial department that is mandated or required to provide a certain intermediary role in a city to make sure that these partnerships around transitioning to sustainability are charted. I can give an example with the Cape Town drought. There was a lack of cooperative governance between the three spheres of government, and the Economic Development Partnership, which is a branch of the provincial government, then played that intermediary role to broker the relationships and the agreement for a solution to be found between the three different spheres of government. So that was what that research project highlighted. And then the one around indicators was really saying that there is no alignment at the moment between the different reporting systems. So let's say there's a national climate change strategy, that is then required to be translated at the local level, and local municipalities required to then report to that national department that's responsible for that strategy on how they're doing in terms of progressing. The indicators that are used are not uniform across cities, and different reporting systems exist. So there needs to be an alignment there, and that the common policy objectives need to form the basis for that alignment. And then the showcase of sustainability practices really showed opportunities that are being harnessed to create livable and sustainable cities, but that there is a need to upscale, to replicate and accelerate the transition, but that cooperative governance is really the unlocking lever for all of these to happen. You can go to the next slide, please, Anel. Next one. So things that are related to governance are that there needs to be a new cooperative governance mindset shift in terms of practices and codes that are used at the local government level, but also across all spheres of government. There needs to be support for the work that intermediaries do, because they are very instrumental in brokering some of these partnerships, and also enabling municipalities or cities to have space, to provide space for innovation, in also bringing in different urban actors, etc. But there's also a need for long-term differentiated city plans. So if we look at some of our cities, like the city of Johannesburg has a long-term city development strategy, which goes up to 2040, but not all cities have that. And that will help provide directionality in terms of where cities are going and what sustainability transition goals they've set for themselves. And also then looking at indicators, there's a need to develop a coherent and aligned set of indicators across cities and to monitor those indicators. Building partnerships between cities and communities, not to wait for a crisis. The pandemic has really shown us the need for that, and building of trust between cities and communities. And then the last one is around integrated infrastructure plans that cities need to put in place. And this is related to the IUDF, which is the urban policy of the country, the Integrated Urban Development Framework, which really calls for this to happen so that cities are able to plan ahead, so that implementation of these policies does indeed take place. I'll end off there, Marius. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ditebogo. I'm always in awe of the work that the SACN is doing. And I'm glad that you mentioned even if in passing, partnerships and non-state actors involved in urban governance broadly above government, because I'm especially interested in the legal mechanisms that regulate those relationships, and I don't think that we're paying enough attention to those. You mentioned that we have great policy frameworks in place, and that implementation is often tricky. And that's true, but I think that it draws attention to not the sort of grand vision enabling kind of laws and policies, but to perhaps the lack of more structural nitty-gritty kind of laws and regulations at especially a local government level that sort of determine ways in which cities function. I'm saying a lot and I shouldn't be. What I should be saying is thank you very much to all of you for incredibly rich presentations. I think between you've covered the topic from both inside and outside the law, both inside and outside the city, and then also at different scales, globally, nationally, and locally. I'd like to throw open the floor for comments, questions, and discussion. Apparently, our chat function is dysfunctional, and so it falls on me to spot hands. If you would please raise hands and then really believe that I will see it, in which case maybe I could. I do see one. And I can't see whose it is. Anel, it is you.
Thank you very much, Marius, and colleagues, apologies for that chat function not being functional. I will break the ice, but before I do so, just also from my end, thank you to all of the presenters. What a rich contribution you've all made from a more, as Sue said, a theoretical point of view, and also from a more practical point of view. And that's what I like so much when these two can meet. For now, I've got a question for Sue, and it relates to your K in Peak. And I really thought you so eloquently explained knowledge with reference to the law having formative and deconstructive power. And I was wondering from your perspective, and given that you are not a lawyer, but your work is so much influenced by the law and what you study, do you think that we have enough principles for decision-making in law, considering how formative principles can be, as opposed to a typical black letter rule within, say, an act, for example, or a piece of legislation. So if you could respond to your view on legal principles to inform decision-making, and then I will give others a chance. I see a few more hands. Thank you.
Chanel, it's such an interesting question, and I know there are people who in the room, so to speak, who might have much more insight into that. I mean, one of the things which does strike me, though, is that I think that we get confused about the principles that underpin the formulation of the law and the principles of the application of the law and the principles of the scaling up of the law. And it does seem to me to be, and in fact, frankly, the principles of the application of the law, because I think we don't talk nearly enough about that. In other words, we combine to agree that we will enforce some kinds of law more rigorously than we do others. And that seems to me to be something that we should be looking at. It is a matter of principle, in other words. And I think if you think like a city in that regard, I think as opposed to think like a human rights lawyer, and I'm interested that I'm drawing that distinction. But in other words, if you think about place and you think about people, or you think about planet, I think you will come up with very different kinds of attitudes to each of those principles. And my worry is that some of what I see in the wider discussion of the practice of urban law is that it's very short-termist, and it's very it's super moralistic on occasions in a way that is often ill-informed about what is ultimately in the public interest. So, I'm venturing into territory. I really am ill-equipped. Those are observations, not more than that. But certainly, I think your question goes to the heart of not just the formulation of the law, but also the practice of the law. And that's where I would encourage us to actually look a little bit more closely.
Thank you very much, Sue. I can but only agree. And I will come back to that later. I see a few other hands for you, Maury.
Question.
Thank you very much. So the next hand I saw, I'm seeing a few, but the next one I saw is Marisol Boertes.
Thank you, Prof. Pieterse. I appreciate the opportunity, and I want to thank all of the speakers. It was really, really interesting, all of the presentations.
Marisol, we can't hear you.
Oh my. I am unmuted.
I can hear.
I can hear.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. So I just wanted to just take this opportunity. I had a question for Robert, but I see he has since left. But maybe someone else can answer it. I don't know. But I have a question for each speaker, if I may be so bold and use this opportunity. But the first question, the one that I had for Robert, was how can the relationship between places and spaces, as well as institution, in combination with the role of the law, be made clear and functional? So I don't know if anyone else can answer that one. And then I had a question for Sheila. Do you think that cities or local governments can regulate in terms of climate change and promote climate resilience and so forth in cities besides through land use regulation and building codes? For example, through local environmental governance instruments. And then I actually have two questions for Letibogo. Firstly, I noticed that the State of the City report for 2016 was 5 years ago. So I wanted to know, is the new one coming out in 2022 or in 2021? And does this not create or result in outdated information or data, considering that cities are dynamic in nature and are constantly undergoing change, whether it be through their political systems, the environment, and so forth? And then also, how does change in leadership at the local government level impact sustainability practices? And those are the questions. Sorry, I realized I didn't ask Susan a question.
Given that we've had questions for a number of speakers, I think what I should do is to maybe invite even a few more and then give each speaker a chance to respond. So if we can have Joandri right next, and then after Joandri's question, Stephen Beresford.
Hi, Prof. Thank you so much. Thank you to all the speakers for your presentations. It was really enlightening. My question is for Susan. You mentioned that how and where we publish plays a role in using the law to reconstruct cities. And what advice can you give us as emerging legal scholars on publishing and disseminating our research so it makes an impact and contributes to this reconstructing of cities?
Stephen, do you want to go?
Yep. Sorry, I've hello, can you hear me? Yeah. Hi. I wanted just to pick up the discussion that Sue raised about, well, that Anel raised, that Sue responded to around principles, because I think it's something that we've had a lot of experience on in legal reform, particularly in South Africa. And I'm sorry, a bit of a South African domination of the conversation at the moment, but I think that we've learned a great deal about that, and it was in the 1990s. It was an easy way to convince lawmakers that the thrust of legislation had changed, because you put a set of principles in the front of the legislation, saying that the law must be interpreted in particular ways, it must encourage particular outcomes, but you're not engaging with the nuts and bolts of the law, the standards that Sue was talking about, the rules, the procedures, the property rights protection, all the things that hold that hold our cities in place, that prevent change, and particularly prevent things like adaptation and mitigation of climate change. And so I think that one has to caution, that the principles are important because they give us a normative framework. But if we're not grappling with what the law is saying about building standards, about about energy efficiency and about vehicles and about spatial form, and that you can put very satisfying principles, and you can spend years. I mean, we know this. You can argue about these principles for a very long time and get very worked up about the principles at the great opportunity cost of not dealing with the nuts and bolts. So I think one has to caution against that. And I'm sorry, there's drilling going on above me, so I'm going to stop now.
I'm going to take one more question from James Chakwizira before I will, in reverse order, ask our panelists to respond. James.
Thank you, Chair. And let me also just thank all the presenters for some fantastic presentations. I have a question for each of them. I'll start with Sheila. I think I enjoyed your presentation, especially with respect to some of the innovations that are linked to just transitions that are being attempted in the USA. My question is, what are the specific incentives and the penalties that are being used in the USA and in some of those cities that are progressive, and why is it working in those places? And then in those places where it's not working, what would be the reason? Then for Susan, I will pick you up on also your strong area, where you have written a lot in terms of urban dynamics and urban planning law, and how it can also work to the advantage of communities and society. Now, my big question is to say, normally you find when we look at our urban areas, we think of densification, we think of spatially targeting, developments in specific areas, sometimes compaction, of course, agglomeration economies, they come around. But of course, with COVID-19, we have been asked to re-question our fundamental thinking approaches. And now, what are the kind of forms of relaxation or reconsolidation do you envisage post-COVID-19? And then my last one is for my good friend from the South African Cities Network. I like the work that the South African Cities Network does, which is fantastic. And you gave us a brilliant example of Joburg, which has a lot of capacity muscle because it's a big city, and it has the 2040 development plan, which when you read it, the reading of it is fantastic. Of course, you raise the issue that perhaps the implementation is the challenge. Now I'm asking and saying we have small to medium-sized cities in the country. What type of plans could they come up with which are pitched at the same level but are not necessarily requiring the same kind of resources as what Joburg had to utilize, so that they are also able to achieve the same impact but at scale and relevant to their size of development? Thank you.
Thank you very much, James, and to all these probing questions. I'm reminded when people say things about good policies and good laws and poor implementation, that if Maria Muti was here in this meeting today, she would have interrupted and said if the law was so good, it would be implementable. And that's something that we must consider. Ditebogo, I know the last question was for you, but I've already committed to asking you to respond first. So if you're okay with going.
Yes, Marius, thank you so much. And thank you so much for those questions. So I'll start with the last one. There is a program that we have together with the National Department of Corporative Governance and Traditional Affairs on intermediate cities, the smaller to medium-sized cities that you talk about. And you'll find that even some of them, if I make an example of Umhlatuzi, Richards Bay, some of them are so much more productive and much more advanced than some of our own metros. I'll give an example of Mangaung, for instance. If you contrast the two, Umhlatuzi will come out tops in terms of their planning, in terms of their economy, in terms of how they're managing their city. So I think that there is a case to be made for these cities to be given the level of support that the bigger metros get. And we are certainly in that program with the Department of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs. They've got a specific intermediate cities program, and in some of these intermediate cities, they are piloting the implementation of the integrated urban development framework. So they're trying to see at that scale of a intermediate cities, how best can the IUDF be implemented? And those lessons can actually be fed up to the metropolitan municipalities. So thanks for that. Then the question around the SOC are being outdated with the 5-year cycle that we use. Absolutely, and we have come to that realization. I mean, the last 5-year period, 2016 to 2021, has really been a tumultuous period for our cities. We've had coalition governments, we've had some cities changing mayors every year. If you look at the city of Tshwane, Nelson Mandela Bay, we've had so many climate change impacts. If you look at the 2018 drought in Cape Town and now Nelson Mandela Bay as well, we've had the civil unrest, we've had COVID. So there's been so many disruptions, so to speak, in the last 5-year period. And we've come to the recognition that we really need to be more responsive in how we provide the, what's the word I'm looking for, the evidence to cities that they need to focus on certain aspects, they need to change how they govern, and they need to really be responsive. So we also need to be responsive. So as the municipalities' 5-year term come to an end, so does ours as well. We work on that similar cycle. So every 5 years, we start a new programmatic cycle, which is really determined by what has happened in the previous 5 years. So we've recognized that we need to have a State of Cities report midterm, so that it informs how then cities manage the rest of their term as well. And then we'll have another one at the end. So you'll see in this 5-year period that we started in July 2021 to to June 2026, we will have a mid-term State of Cities report and then an end-of-term State of Cities report. So we've really recognized the need for that. And then the other question was around leadership and how it affects sustainability, the change in leadership. Like I mentioned, City of Tshwane had 5 or how many mayors in the past 5 years. And that does unfortunately affect the sustainability vision of a city. If you look at the City of Tshwane, I'm sorry I'm picking on them, but we had such a great discussion with them earlier this morning at another session we had. The City Sustainability Unit is smack in the middle of the Executive Mayor's office. So any changes that happen in there, in the mayor's office, affect the City Sustainability Unit. And their role as the City Sustainability Unit is to advise, is to provide an advisory role to all the other departments. So if a mayor comes in and their agenda or their priority is not sustainability, then the focus shifts. I'll give an example of the city of Joburg as well, with the Corridors of Freedom initiative that Mayor Parkstau at that time had initiated. And then when Mayor Mashaba came in, he's like, that's not my focus. I want to clean up the city. I want to focus on the city finances, which was good. But then the sustainability agenda fell off the rails. So there is, I guess, maybe also it's something that academia can look at, and how those challenges of short-termism can be overcome in our cities. Thank you.
Thanks, Titebogo. Sheila, before I hand over to you, interested, based on what Titebogo has just said, that in South Africa, we struggle not only with preemption, in the same way as the cities, but also with its opposite, where progressive national policies and progressive national urban policies are sabotaged for small party political gains at a city level. And so it was especially interesting to hear what you were saying about preemption from that angle. But if you would, at the question.
Sure. Yeah. So I think the first question was on local governance mechanisms. To what degree can cities innovate in that area? And I did mention a couple what I call inclusive governance mechanisms that we see popping up in cities that allow frontline communities and vulnerable populations to participate in policy design and implementation. And that's an area where I think we see a lot of, I say innovation, but it is in a sense for these cities happening, and that's what I would call co-design and even kind of co-governance, something I write a lot about. And that can be as specific as the kinds of thing that I talked about in Boston and St. Louis, those mechanisms which allow the design processes around building design and also building standards for greenhouse gas emissions. And I do emphasize building, not because that's an easy area of regulation, but because if most of your greenhouse gases are coming from the built environment, then it's not surprising to see that being kind of low-hanging fruit for cities. So there's some co-design there, as in Boston and St. Louis, but also in the energy transition. I mentioned distributed energy systems as a way to transition big cities like LA and New York to a cleaner environment. So microgrids, for instance. There's co-governance being proposed there by groups in like Harlem, climate justice, environmental justice groups like We Act, who have a whole planning scheme that would allow them to set up microgrids around Harlem, taking the excess energy from city buildings, the city university, hospitals, et cetera, and have their own independent microgrid that they co-govern. And that those would be nested or embedded in a larger energy transition plan. So I think that those are at the kind of forefront of governance mechanisms that are being innovated in particular in the larger cities, but not just. The second question was about just transitions and what are specific incentives and penalties. Why are they working, not working? I mean, I think that the probably biggest innovation there is the Justice 40 initiative that I mentioned. And those are not incentives or penalties as much as a commitment to direct what seems to be a significant influx of money coming down from federal governments and states to cities on energy transition, to make sure a lot of that money is getting to frontline communities. So I think Biden is just about to announce his plan. They finally agreed before he goes off to Europe. I was just reading about it. And so it turns out that there's a lot of money for climate infrastructure there. So one question is, how do you make the transition using those dollars? And one thing you do is you make sure that those dollars are directed at vulnerable communities. I also mentioned the fines for noncompliance in some cities for not achieving the greenhouse gas reduction emissions in the built environment, that again, some cities are directing those funds to a just transition purpose or to equitable or to equity. So that's another example. So I'm following a lot of what are really kind of brand new innovations in cities. And I think that it remains to be seen whether these mechanisms for a just transition really play out according to the principles, talking about principles that are shaping them. We don't know yet, basically.
Thank you very much, Susan.
Yeah, thanks, colleagues, and interesting reflections from other panelists. So thank you for that. On the question of where to publish, it's a very important question because I think it's a strategic question, not just for the individual, but for the community of practice. So in other words, there's an issue around, do you try and position the question of the law within the urban debate? Or do you try and position the urban within the legal community? And I think, that it does require slightly different kinds of reading and a slightly different orientation and slant. So, I mean, of course, one has to do a little bit of both. And sometimes it's possible to cast the same body of work slightly differently for different audiences. But to assume that people who are urbanists are reading legal journals doesn't follow. And similarly, I think to assume that the legal community are reading the urban journals absolutely doesn't follow. My personal bias at this point is that I would argue that it's probably more important to build a cohort of a specialist area of legal practice that is around the city. And allow for some sort of other more general. Urban studies is a much noisier place, and so my inclination, but I may be wrong on that. With one caveat is that I think it's possible, depending on what one is publishing, and different things are useful for different purposes. So in order to become a famous legal expert, there are a set of top legal journals you have to publish in, right? But sometimes what you're talking about is a very particular case, and it's useful because it's a local case, and it's useful for teaching because it's a local case. It's useful for setting precedent because it's a local case. And there I would argue that it's much more important to get it into a local journal. It may not need as bold or as big. The case can be the substance of the paper rather perhaps than some of the wider theoretical material. And I think particularly in the global south and it's where the value of South Africa lies, is that we don't know enough about a whole domains of legal practice in the city. And so quite a lot of what is actually just individual case-based material is actually innovative and worth publishing for in its own right. So I would have a set of journals and perhaps be a little bit more kind of conscious about why you're publishing in each. And then it needs to fall behind a wider aspiration of, where are you seeing yourself positioned as a scholar? And then to think about it like that. And then perhaps as a community to make sure you have the odd book that gets to a slightly wider audience, and that would be there. So that's my kind of slightly off the cuff sense, but that would be where I would do it. And certainly I would love to see, imagine if South African cities, which surely have got as many challenges as anywhere, were producing a cohort of world-class urban lawyers in exactly the same way as we produce a cadre of constitutional lawyers. Why do the Brazilians have done it to some extent, but why are we not doing the same? And it seems to me to be that's something we really should be pushing for very, very hard. So that's that. And then on the question of on the post-COVID question, really interesting from a legal point of view. I'm slightly frustrated with some of the post-COVID discussions in the urban debates because I think it's foregrounded the design professionals and everyone wants to rebuild the city and have COVID safe spaces, etc. My own feeling is, and this perhaps picks up on the point about principles that we were having earlier, is that we've got quite a lot of regulation where if we actually simply applied it, we would land up with much safer cities. And in particular, I think about some of the markets, the food markets, and some of us have been saying this for a very long time. The idea that the failure to enforce public safety standards is somehow anti-poor, for me is just crazy. You know, we're happy to let upmarket supermarkets self-regulate, but the places where people actually do become sick because markets are poorly managed and poorly regulated seems to me to be very problematic. So I would argue that there's some very obvious areas around air quality, water quality, food safety that one could look at. And we don't have to do anything new, but we do have to actually think about, and maybe it's exactly that point about, you know, when is it useful to have a discussion about principles? And this seems to me to be one. I thought Stephen's reflection there, Stephen, I mean, it would be very interesting for you to have an even wider reflection, because I know you were at the forefront of using the idea of principles as a strategic entry point into law reform. But, you know, what have we lost in that process would be an important question for me. And, you know, have we allowed, because we didn't know what to regulate and we feared the ability, Marius, your point about if the law's good enough, why isn't it being implemented? And that's absolutely right. You know, where do you set the standards? How do you set them that they are enforceable and useful? But I do fear that what we've done in the process of throttling back on any debates about enforcement is effectively to allow the rich to do as they wish. We've abdicated from one of the principal points of law, which is to create a public good and to enforce universal rights. So my sense is that that's something we might want to get back into a discussion on. And the city is an ideal terrain within which to do that. And the post-COVID city, you know, to Andrew's point, is even probably the most important place to do that.
Thank you very much. I am not sure, Maricel and Johandri, whether your hands went back up or whether they've been up all along. To me, they look like they've been up all along. I do know that Anel's hand has just popped back up. So Maricel and Johandri, either speak now or forever hold your peace. I see Maricel's put her legacy hand down. Sorry for calling you out like this. Anel, do you want to go ahead with the question so long?
Sure, I've got so many, but the immediate one is for Sheila. Listening to you, Sheila, it was striking for me how big the differences are between South Africa and the US in relation to climate change initiatives, specifically in the funding available and so on. But I was wondering, I didn't pick up from your examples, and I'm sorry if I missed it. To what extent do you see cities going for incentives? Because the law, one of the key functions of the law, if not the key function, is to regulate human behavior. And from where I stand, I think we don't use incentives in law enough for purposes of changing human behavior, in particular when it gets to questions of sustainability and climate transitions.
That's a great question. And I think that US law is characterized in general on environmental law and specifically in the developing climate framework by what I would call both sticks and carrots, right? And so the regulatory sticks are the, you know, you must reduce to this level by this means, right? Those are quickly going out of favor toward more, you know, a kind of race to the top. Here's the incentive. And I think that President Biden is just about to announce a deal on his plan, and all of the climate stuff in there are incentives, right? It's all money flowing down to incentivize actors to reach a particular goal, but to leave it up to them as to how to do it. And so at the local level, we see that tax abatements, tax incentives, zoning incentives. So for instance, and we do this in affordable housing and other areas, that you want to come and you want to build something, the zoning code gives you as of right, the right to build so high. But if you give us 30% affordable housing, or if you design it to be this clean, you can have a little bit more bulk, right? Or you can have a little bit, you can get around the rules. So that's a kind of incentive. It need not always be dollars, right? But it could be a regulatory incentive to basically loosen up regulation. So I think the sticks and carrots is very much, they kind of play with each other, but they also, importantly, I think some of the largest reductions just on pollution control under our Federal Clean Air Act, for instance, has been when the Clean Air Act moved from health standards to these incentives. And they kind of set the level of reductions according to the industry that was incentivized to then research and develop, and they got there a lot quicker, right, through technology, through those incentives. So I think that's a huge area of opportunity at all levels of government.
Do you want to ask some of your others now? Joandre, are you there? I still see your hand.
Thanks, Maurice. Joandre's hand is down on our side, so it might be that it just sticked.
Waving at me all the time. Okay.
So while I have Sue online, because with Witwatersrand, I can just drive to Johannesburg at some point and we could have a lovely coffee. But Sue, I can't speak to every day. Sue, I was wondering what is the background of the PEAK project, and is it multidisciplinary? I probably can just go to the website and read it, but I found the whole idea of how the PEA and K are structured together extremely interesting. And I was thinking how rich it can be involving scholars from, different disciplinary fields, and perhaps you do. And I will definitely read more about it, but perhaps for purposes of the rest of the you could just fill us in a little bit on the design.
Yeah, I mean, it is a project that is explicitly interdisciplinary, and it's one of these very large, unusually actually in the urban space, multi-site. So it's Colombia, India, China, South Africa, and to some extent the UK. And in a way, it's an effort to look at multi-scale, multi-sector, multidisciplinary perspectives on implementing effectively the SDGs. The problem is that so many of those frameworks that talk about that stuff are very apolitical, and they're not engaged in practice in any meaningful way. So, and the other difficulty is that some of the sort of conventional points of dealing with tensions in the urban space, which traditionally used to fall to planners, have effectively become so much more complex because the information is more complex, the issues are more complex, and because government doesn't control everything. And so some of what we were trying to look at is this idea of what's commensurable and what's not commensurable, and what do we need to know. But perhaps more importantly, what we were trying to do was to try and create a community of young scholars, the early career researchers in particular, who were able to be in the way that lawyers have to be, I have to say. And it always amazes me, you get lawyers who know much more about energy transitions than energy transition specialists do. But what do you need to know about a city in order to make an intervention? And how do you deal with questions of prioritization? How do you deal with questions of incommensurability when there really are conflicts that you have to deal with substantively? And when the evidence is not presented to you in the same way, using the same kinds of methodologies, because the truth is that the transport engineers think fundamentally differently from how the anthropologists do, and they therefore give you very different reasons and positions on how you should act. So some of what we were trying to say is that if we are to get a cohort of people who are, if you like, specialist generalists, then we need to help them. We need to make legible what the city is. And I think that is so that was the origins of the PEAK. It was like, we do need to know something about how we read and what the metrics are. How do we observe? We do need to know and have the ability to analyze the interconnections and the points of confluence in these complex systems. We do need to know something about the systems that hold and bind, many of which, as I said, were legal. And then, of course, the knowledge thing is really about kind of how do we reproduce that, and how do we share that, how do we scale that up. And when we first started it, I just thought, oh, this is just a framework like any other project has a holding framework for a large project. But to be honest, the more I've looked at that scheme, and I'm actually trying to use a version of it at the moment for WHO, who are trying to look at creating a way of understanding all of their programs on health. I think it does get to stuff that we haven't otherwise done. And for me, it's more helpful than some of the kind of what I sort of think of as late 20th century, early 21st century kind of rights-based language for the city. So I don't find, and be careful I get quoted on this, but I don't find the language of the right to the city particularly helpful because it doesn't actually tell us what to do. And I think some of these things begin to make the literal entry points, the operational entry points, a bit more legible. That's the aspiration anyway.
Thank you very much, Sue. And now I've deliberately asked that question because if you recall what we start with and the anchor questions of today's discussion, I think many of those run the risk of being treated by scholars like municipalities themselves treat problems in a silo fashion, very fragmented way. And I think with the audience also we have today, we need to guard against trying to address problems created by fragmentation by just further adopting a fragmented approach in our scholarship and research. So you don't have to respond to that, but I'm happy to hear how you've been approaching this project.
If you listen to what Lihlobohole was saying and what Sheila was saying, actually, when cities do things, they like it to conform to environmental rights or human, whatever, socioeconomic rights. But to do that, they have to get into the detail. Okay, and so the practice is in the detail, and it's the ability to translate the normative position through the conduit of law, sometimes through the conduit of technology, but that's beyond our remit today, but certainly through the conduit of law. It's that ability to give life to it, to give longitudinal life that will survive for generations and will be implemented. That's what the law's got to do. And if the law simply stops at the point of saying what we should do, then it's no use to anybody.
I see two new hands. I see Melandri, I see Joandri, and I see Stephen having just raised his hand again. I think let us take those as a last round of questions, then have a last round of responses, and then I'll start thanking. Melandri? Sorry, who I also saw was Nicolene, but that hand has since gone down. So Nicolene, if you're also in there, please go after Melandri's gone.
Okay. Can you hear me, Prof. Marius? Okay. Thank you again for wonderful discussions from all the panelists. Something that Prof. Carnell just mentioned really set my mind alight. So it really adds to Prof. Arnaldo Plessis' question about compartmentalization or the silo thinking. So I would really like the panelists to just elaborate a little bit more on how the just transition specifically can play a part in the move towards climate resilient cities. And if we are looking towards having more just and equitable societies, as is part of the focus of today's discussion, we need to ask what are the current mechanisms that can be leveraged for this, and if there aren't, what can be done? And Prof. Parnell already alluded to that in her response to Prof. Plessis' question. But I think when we're looking at the energy sector, there tends to be a compartmentalization of the transition debate, and if we need to kind of so it tends to overlook the opportunities that exist, especially when it comes to spatial transformation. So I just would like to hear your views on this. And, when we're talking about transforming the city, that can take decades to plan, especially when we're talking about actually implementing the policies and strategies. So what are some of the things that we can do that are more immediate, but that are forward-looking and that are more aligned with the future thinking that we want from cities or municipalities specifically? Thank you.
Stephen, do you want to go?
Sure, thanks. Sorry, Sue's comments keep triggering me to respond. Sue, we should catch up one day. But so Sue said she wanted to stop at technology in her comment now. And I think that particularly if we're looking at climate change and what cities need to do to adapt and to mitigate climate change, and we're looking at the difficulties that cities, particularly African cities, have and developing country cities have in capacity to comply with legislation, there are huge advances in technology now that enable the building inspector to determine the level of energy efficiency in the building, to determine the level of flood vulnerability of the informal settlement to more intense climate. So I think that there's a real, I think that the climate challenge, and I think that there's a real opportunity with COP and post-COP and the just transition to really look at urban law differently. Instead of throwing up our hands and saying it's so difficult, we've got a real imperative here, and we've got all sorts of technological tools with which lawyers are not comfortable and familiar, but which enable urban decision making to be made much more easily, with much less dependence on experts in municipal government. Most teenagers can operate the technology that you need to help decision making, particularly around the climate transition. And so I would really seize on that as an opportunity to, and I wouldn't stop at technology. I think that it's a key lens into the future that the urban legal fraternity, sorority needs to take on.
Yes.
So
when you put out too much fumes, you just cut it off because you can.
Yeah. So and I think again there's a bit of a knee-jerk response to the smart city narratives, and there are very problematic aspects of the smart city narrative, but they're extremely helpful ones.
Absolutely.
And there are extremely important pro-poor ones. All sorts of automated measuring and metering, whether it's the food safety standards in the market or water and electricity consumption, whatever, all sorts of things that need to be embraced and incorporated into a more just, forward-looking legal framework, and not ignored or rejected out of hand. I think we need a much more critical evaluation of some of these discussions. And my final point is the politics and the difficulty, the tensions between law and politics and capacity. And the obvious thing is, in any decent society, we only get law from politicians. I mean, we get elected people make the laws that govern us, and they appoint the people who implement them, and we have to work within that system. And I think, to go back to the point of that, a good law is one that can be implemented, and that is something that needs to be much more firmly pushed in advocacy with lawmakers. And I just go back to then saying that technology does start to make some of that easier than it has been in the past. Thanks. It's been a really interesting afternoon's discussion.
The clock has gone 4 p.m. In this side of the world anyway. Do our speakers have any last words in any which order? I'm seeing shakes of the head from Sue and Sheila, and I do not see you, Ditebogo. Are you shaking?
Here I am. No, I'd just like to thank the panelists. It's been very engaging discussions, and I'm not a lawyer or inclined anyway towards law, but it's been quite interesting. And what Stephen has just said just brings to mind the fact that cities are so compliance focused. So as he was talking about the opportunities to look at technology as some of the solutions, I'm already thinking, oh, they're going to think supply chain, a tender has to be issued, MFMA won't allow us to do that, so I think there's sort of like a paralysis in how the law and legislation can be used in cities, and we need to address that fear of not getting a tick from the Auditor General when you do things that are innovative or that respond to the challenges that you face as a city. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And so thank you again to everyone on our panel for your time, for your expertise. I'm a public lawyer and a rights lawyer in the first instance, and I am very excited as to the many things that you said that sort of just remind me how much work there is to do. And to our audience for an engaging and a rich discussion this afternoon, to UN Habitat for always pushing us to have these engagements, and also then to Anal and to CLES and for everyone for organizing this. There's been a lot of behind the scenes work here that needs to be acknowledged.
Thank you for inviting us.
And a great day. Cheers, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.